There's a kind of misery that only loyal people understand. It happens when you give everything, years of your life, waiting for the person in charge to finally look at you and say, "Good job." And they never do. In Transformers Armada, there's a warrior who lives inside that silence. His name is Starscream. More than once, he stands in front of Megatron, wounded, exhausted, and underneath everything he's done, there's two questions. Do you see me? Do I matter? Megatron gives him almost nothing, just enough to keep him chasing, and that's when you realize something. This Starscream isn't chasing power, he's chasing recognition, and that kind of battle doesn't stay on the battlefield. It follows you into your career, your relationships, your sense of worth. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, and today we're asking, what happens when a man spends his life trying to earn approval from someone who is never going to give it? Starscream's story doesn't begin with betrayal. It begins with loyalty. Real loyalty. The kind that shows up early, works harder than everyone else, takes the hits, and keeps going. And for a while, that kind of loyalty looks like strength. Because when you believe the person you're serving deserves it, commitment feels honorable. But there's another version of loyalty people don't talk about. The kind that slowly reshapes your identity around someone else's approval. I understand that version better than I'd like to, because I walked a path like that once. A path that kept forcing myself down, long after something in me knew it wasn't right. We'll come back to that. But first, we need to understand what happened to Starscream. In Transformers Armada, Starscream isn't chasing Megatron's throne. He's chasing Megatron's respect. He's trying to win his favor. And that difference changes everything. He fights harder than anyone, volunteers for the most dangerous missions, throws himself into battles other soldiers hesitate to enter, not because he loves war, but because he wants to prove he belongs. And every time he does, Megatron withholds approval. No praise, no acknowledgement, sometimes criticism, and sometimes nothing at all. And that's where the trap forms. If Megatron rejected him completely, Starscream might walk away. If Megatron respected him fully, the tension would disappear. But Megatron does something far more dangerous. He gives just enough validation to keep hope alive. A compliment once in a while, a brief moment of trust, a flicker of acknowledgement, then it's gone again. So Starscream pushes harder, because maybe the next mission will earn it. Maybe the next victory will change things. Maybe if he proves himself one more time, Megatron will finally see him. That cycle, effort, denial, hope, effort again, becomes his identity. And once loyalty becomes identity, walking away feels like losing yourself. There's a moment early in the series where the pressure finally cracks. Starscream questions Megatron publicly. Not rebellion, not a betrayal, just a soldier asking why his loyalty is never enough. Megatron humiliates him in front of everyone, and Starscream accepts it. And you could see it happen. That internal fracture, pride colliding with submission, respect colliding with fear. It's the moment Starscream becomes dangerous, because resentment is now sharing a place with loyalty. Scripture describes this dynamic with brutal precision. Fear of man will prove to be a snare. A snare isn't something forced on you. It's something you step into, because you're trying to gain something you feel you need. Starscream's deeper fear isn't Megatron hurting him. He's afraid of what it means if Megatron never respects him, and that fear keeps him bound, keeps him performing, competing, enduring, even when part of him already knows it may never be enough. This doesn't just happen in battle, it happens in careers, in families, in relationships, in the quiet places where we keep trying to earn approval from someone who has already decided we're not enough. I recognize that cycle, because there was a season of my life where I lived inside it too, where I kept chasing something long after I should have stopped. We'll get into that, but first, we need to see how far Starscream's loyalty actually goes. Loyalty always has a cost. At first it feels noble, you're working harder, sacrificing more, pushing further than everyone around you, so when things start going wrong, you don't question the direction, you double down. Because quitting would mean admitting all that effort might have been misplaced, and that's a terrifying thought. Starscream lives inside the tension for most of Armada. He keeps serving Megatron, keeps fighting, keeps proving himself, even when the pattern is obvious. Megatron isn't going to change, and the reason I recognize that pattern so clearly is because I've lived it too. There was a point in my life where I was absolutely convinced I was going to be a doctor. Not casually interested, convinced. It was the identity I built my future around, what success was supposed to look like, what validation was supposed to come from, what I believed would prove I mattered, and for a long time, I never stopped to ask a simple question: did I actually want this? Because when you're chasing approval from family, from expectations, from the image of who you're supposed to be, the goal itself can start to feel sacred. Like walking away would mean failure, so I kept pushing. Even when it stopped making me happy, even when the obstacles felt heavier than they should have, even when something in my gut was telling me, this might not be your path. Eventually, the truth becomes unavoidable. The motivation wasn't there, not because I was weak, because it wasn't mine. And that realization hurt more. But it taught me something important. Effort doesn't prove you're right. Sometimes, effort just proves you're invested. And investment can trap you. I wish I could say I learned that lesson immediately. I didn't. Because years later, I repeated the pattern. When I opened my comic shop, this was my one dream, which made it harder to let go. I worked constantly, pushed harder every month, told myself I just figured out one more thing, one more strategy, one more solution. I could force it to succeed. But there was a feeling that started to creep in, quiet at first, then louder, that gut sense that something wasn't working, that I might be pushing towards something unsustainable, and I ignored it, because I had invested too much. Time, money, identity. Walking away didn't feel like losing a business, it felt like losing a part of myself, and that's exactly where Starscream lives. Because in Armada, there comes a moment when he understands something devastating. Megatron isn't withholding respect temporarily. Megatron was never going to give it. Not because Starscream failed, but because Megatron doesn't value him. That realization changes the equation. The missions weren't tests, they were proof he could be used. That loyalty wasn't respected, it was exploited. The game was rigged. He doesn't care. Starscream wasn't being trained, he was being drained. And that moment is terrifying, because if the person you're trying to impress doesn't care, what does that say about the years you gave them? Scripture captures this kind of self-deception with brutal honesty. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is destruction. Not because someone is foolish, because conviction can blind you. Responsibility isn't just endurance, it's discernment, knowing when to push, and when you're pushing in the wrong direction. And here's where something else happens to Starscream. Pain turns into resentment, resentment turns into anger, and anger looks for somewhere to go. And that's how loyalty breaks. That's how good soldiers become dangerous. Because when pain has nowhere to go, it will always find a target. Not because they were evil, but because they were wounded. And once that realization starts, there's no going back. Because the next question becomes unavoidable. If loyalty isn't working, what do you do now? Realizing something isn't working doesn't immediately tell you what to do next. Because walking away from the wrong authority doesn't just change your situation, it changes who you think you are. If your identity was built around approval, separation feels like collapse. And that's exactly what happens to Starscream. For most of Transformers Armada, Starscream believes Megatron defines his purpose. Commander, leader, judge of his worth, so when he finally breaks away, it isn't freedom at first, it's disorientation. Because once Megatron is gone from the center of his world, Starscream has to answer a terrifying question. Who am I without him? He leaves the Decepticons, not because he suddenly becomes noble, but because the illusion finally breaks. Megatron was never going to give him what he needed, and staying would only destroy what little self-respect he had left. This is one of the most important moments in the series, because separation is the first step towards maturity. Scripture puts it plainly. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. Maturity isn't just growth, it's abandonment. Letting go of systems, the identities, the authorities that kept you stuck. I lived a version of that moment too. Closing the comic shop felt like failure. Years of effort, money, stress, sacrifice, and walking away felt like losing a part of myself. Because for so long, my identity had been tied to making it work. Provider, business owner, dream chaser, and without that, who was I? But something else was becoming clear. Staying wasn't protecting my family, it was costing them. My time, my attention, my energy. The same loyalty that once felt responsible had quietly turned destructive, so I stepped away. Not because I stopped caring, because I finally understood what mattered more. That's exactly where Starscream finds himself. Separated from Megatron, but not yet whole. Because breaking from false authority doesn't instantly give you purpose. It just removes the illusion, and now you have to decide what you're going to serve instead. Breaking away doesn't feel heroic. It feels quiet, uncomfortable, sometimes even wrong, because when you remove the thing that defines you, there's a space where identity used to be, and that space can feel terrifying. For Starscream, that silence comes after he leaves Megatron. For me, it came after I closed the shop. And what you discover in that silence determines what kind of man you become next. After Starscream separates from Megatron, something unexpected happens. He doesn't become powerful, he becomes uncertain. Because for the first time, he isn't trying to prove himself to anyone, and without that pressure, he has to confront who he actually is. That's the void most men are afraid of. Not failure, not loss, but the moment where external validation disappears, and you have to decide what matters on your own. I went through that same void. When the shop closed, there wasn't relief at first. There was emptiness, questions, doubt. Who am I if I'm not the business owner? What was all that effort for? Did I just fail my family? But slowly, something clearer started to emerge. I had more time, more presence, more energy to give the people who actually mattered. My wife, my child, my responsibilities at home. And I realized something uncomfortable. For years, I thought I was sacrificing for my family, but I was sacrificing my family for an idea of success that fed my pride. That realization changes you, because it forces you to redefine strength, not as endurance, not as ambition, not as proving something to the world, but as protection, provision, presence. Starscream experiences a similar shift. Separated from Megatron, he begins interacting with the Autobots, even forming a strange bond with Alexis. For the first time, someone sees him without demanding performance, without manipulation, without conditions, and you could see it affect him. His aggression softens, his decisions change, because when approval isn't currency anymore, identity can rebuild around something healthier. Scripture captures this recalibration perfectly. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul? That verse isn't about ambition being evil. It's about priorities being disordered. When ego sits above duty, when pride sits above responsibility, when validation sits above truth, eventually everything collapses. Real strength isn't measured by what you achieve, it's measured by what you protect. And for me, that meant learning something I'd resisted my entire life. I didn't have to carry everything alone. Leaning on my wife, trusting support systems, letting go of the idea that masculinity meant isolation. That wasn't weakness, that was me finally growing up. And that's the same lesson Starscream begins to learn. Strength isn't domination, it isn't recognition, it isn't approval. Strength is choosing what matters most and placing your loyalty there. Family over ego, duty over pride, truth over blind loyalty. Once those priorities reorder, everything else starts making sense. But Starscream's story doesn't end with clarity, because clarity leads to a final test, and his costs him everything. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of your own story, that tension between who you thought you had to be and who you're starting to realize you actually are, that's exactly why this show exists. Disassembled Heroes and Villains isn't about robots or heroes. It's about the moments where identity breaks and something stronger has to replace it. If you want more conversations like this about responsibility, pride, and the cost of becoming a better man, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe and stay here with us. Because these stories aren't really about Cybertronians, they're about us. About the seasons where we have to decide what stays, what goes, and what we're willing to fight for next. If this episode hit close to home, you're not alone. Starscream's story doesn't end with sacrifice. It ends with a question. Because the tragedy wasn't just that he died, it was how long he stayed trapped before he understood the truth. And that's the part that applies to us. Most men don't get trapped because they're weak. They get trapped because they're loyal. Loyal to careers that once made sense, but no longer do. Loyal to leaders who demand sacrifice but never offer respect. Loyal to identities built years ago that don't match the man they're becoming now. And sometimes the most dangerous trap of all, provider identity. Because if you're not praised, at least you're needed. That belief that if you just endure a little longer, push a little harder, sacrifice a little more, everything will eventually pay off. But responsibility without discernment becomes destruction, and loyalty without truth becomes bondage. Scripture puts this plainly. If anyone does not provide for his family, he has denied his faith. Provision isn't just money, it's presence, stability, peace in the home. If what you're doing is destroying those things, You aren't protecting your family, you're sacrificing them to your pride. That's the line Starscream crossed for years, and it's the line many men cross without realizing it. So here's the filter, not a philosophy, not some theory, a practical question you can use this week. If the person you're trying to impress hasn't recognized your effort in years, they aren't blind, they don't care, and they just don't value you. And that changes the decision, because once you accept that truth, waiting longer doesn't fix anything, working harder doesn't fix anything, enduring more doesn't fix a damn thing. It just costs more. If your effort keeps increasing, but respect never does, reassess the system. If staying is costing your family peace, it's already too expensive. If loyalty requires you to ignore your conscience, it isn't loyalty, it's fear. And sometimes, the hardest truth for men to accept is this: walking away is not failure. Sometimes walking away is obedience. Obedience to reality, obedience to responsibility, obedience to what actually matters. Starscream spent most of his life trying to earn approval from someone who could never give it. But in the end, he chose something higher. Protection over pride, truth over loyalty, purpose over validation. And that's the choice every man eventually faces. Not whether he is strong enough to endure, but whether he is wise enough to stop fighting battles that were never meant to define him. At the beginning of this episode, we talked about the kind of misery only loyal people understand. Giving everything, waiting to be seen, hoping the person in charge will finally say, "You mattered." Starscream spent his entire life chasing that moment, and that's the misery loyal people recognize. And in the end, he stopped. He didn't stand in front of Megatron asking for approval anymore. He stood in front of Unicron, knowing he would lose, and chose his own meaning. Not to be praised, not to be promoted, just to do what was right. Starscream didn't die weak. He died free. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting to be recognized. He was fighting for something worthy. He was fighting to prove that strength isn't loyalty to authority. Strength is loyalty to what is right, even when it costs you everything. Sometimes obedience means staying. Sometimes obedience means walking away. But the real honor begins the moment you stop living for someone else's approval and start living in alignment with your responsibility. This has been Disassembled Heroes and Villains. Stay deliberate, stay accountable, and as always, stay handsome.